In this first video, we're going to teach you how to cut Andamooka Matrix opal by hand. Most of the things you need you can get from a local hardware store or a lapidary supplier.
Here's a list of the things you'll need.
I want to show you just how easy it is to cut an opal by hand. This is a piece of Andamooka Matrix opal. And for a beginner, this is about the easiest kind of opal to cut. It's not much to look at right now, and this is a very inexpensive piece of matrix opal. Once you have it in place, just draw yourself a nice line all the way around. Right, easy. Step one is done. Our opal is going to be right here. Means we have to take away all of this stuff, and all of that stuff. So we start with some 80 grit sandpaper and we get it wet, and we start rubbing the opal against that 80 grit sandpaper to remove those areas that are not part of our stone. So whenever you're cutting by hand, this first part is definitely the hardest part. This is about an hour of just grinding on the sandpaper to get to this point. But I'm getting pretty close to the line now, so I'll probably redo that line again and then do the last bit a bit slower and be a bit more careful about it. Little bit by little bit, you can see that corner is starting to come off. Right now I'm just trying to take the sharp edge off. So once you get to this point where your shape is pretty much the oval shape that you're looking for, and you've knocked this top corner off all the way around, all of the angles that you're going to need to cut after that are going to be pretty sharp angles, so you need to put it on a dop stick. And this is a dop stick. It's a stick with a bit of wax on the end of it. So put that here. A bit of wax here on the end of it. And this is the green wax. This is my favorite kind of wax. It works best in all temperatures. Whenever it gets cold, some of the other waxes will drop the stones. This wax will pretty much work all year round. So I tend to use this wax in the shop. At this point, we need to put the stone on the stick because we're going to be cutting the dome up here. And if you cut the dome with your fingers will disappear. Your fingernails will disappear. So start to shape that wax into a little cone. Now this wax melts at about 70 degrees, but you don't have to get the stone that hot. It just needs to be dried. Just stick the stone on this part. You push that wax into a little cone around the stick. Once you do that, you dunk it in some water. You can start to spin it around. You want to make sure that it spins nice and even, just like this. You get your sandpaper back in action here. And now you can start to do the dome because you have a stick. And so instead of tilting it with your fingers, you can actually tilt it with the stick like this. See how I'm just tilting it slightly? So when I'm rocking it like this and like this and like this and like this. So as I pull it, I change the direction of that stick in the air, right? So that it creates a dome. Slowly. The dome is slowly starting to form. And I'm a little proud up in here. Right here. what you need to do is focus and make sure that at this stage the cut is absolutely perfect. So I'll do this a couple more times. I'll make sure it's perfect. And I'll keep on doming it over. And then once I'm convinced that the shape is perfect, then we'll start using the other grits of sanding paper to start taking all the scratches out and start polishing it. And so for this last part of the process, while we're cutting and before the polishing starts, you want to get rid, there's one right there. You see that little line there? So I've got to take that line and put it against the sandpaper back and forth until that line is no longer a line. It's just a nice even dome all the way from the top all the way down to the bottom. It still needs a little bit of work there. So I'll take that little line, put it right in the middle there. Alright, so this is where the cutting part of the process ends and the polishing part of the process begins. We start out with 100 grit sandpaper here, and the object is to just keep the stone moving all around in different angles to take off all of the scratches from the 80 grit sandpaper. Alright, so once you've been hitting it with the 100 grit for a while, you need to check and see how you're doing in terms of the scratches. Now you can't do this wet, so I always, this is even when I'm cutting with a machine, I always have a tea towel over my shoulder or a piece of cloth or something that's absorbent. So once it's dry, then you can see if there's any scratches really easy. So I've got a little bit of scratching on the side and I've got a little scratching on the face. But all in all, pretty good so far. So we'll take it back, we'll rub it on the 100 grit a little bit more, and then we'll move on to the 180. So I got a nice little strip of 180 grit, just like with all of this. Get it nice and wet so you don't have any dust. Put it on your soft surface and start taking out the scratches from the 100 grit stone. Paper. This is a 240. Same thing. Always moving the stone. Now up to the 320. Now there's a rough corner still here, and before we treat the matrix, we need to pop it off the stick and then take that corner off. Slide it up underneath the back like this.
You can also just put it in the freezer for 10 minutes and it'll fall off easily.
Just pop off like that. And you can just clean the wax off with your knife. At this point, I would get my 80 grit sandpaper back out like this. Get it wet again. Give it back a nice flat rub. You just want to make sure there's no wax on the bottom of the stone before you start the treatment process. And just remember, the front of this stone is polished, or it's almost polished now. There's no grit in it, so make sure not to touch the front of the stone to the sandpaper. Alright, so now the last part is to take this edge that goes all the way around it. You don't want that edge to be there because it could make it really hard to set the stone in any kind of bezel setting, to having an edge like there. So you just want to go all the way around the stone, keeping that edge at a 45-degree angle, and just take that edge off. And once you have that edge taken off, I usually go back and get out some 100 grit or similar. And, just straighten it up a bit, because that 80 grit is pretty mean stuff. Leaves it leaves a really nasty looking edge. Okay, remembering not touching any of the polished surface, just touching the corner or the back. Alright, so before it goes into treatment, this is what it should look like. You see that bottom edge has been taken off. It's not very sharp anymore. There's no wax or anything on the bottom. It's not polished. The top is got a very dull polish on it. You don't want it too polished. You want those pores nice and open so that whenever we put it in the treatment that it'll soak that sugar up. If you polish it too much, it won't treat.